All right, so I thank you so much, Julia, and it's a real honor, privilege to be here. I have two disclaimers. I think slower than Dan, and therefore I speak slower than Dan. And the second one is that I don't have any jokes. So if you laugh, you're laughing at me, and I'm going to take it personally. Can we actually lower the lights a bit more, if you don't mind? Okay, so I'm going to talk about cameras and the future of cameras particularly. And I think we can all agree, just living in this age, that we have entered a new age of visual communication. And I'm going to try and explain what this means. Well, on one side, if you think about human expression and if you think about human communication, today photos and videos are being used more so than even text and speech by the younger generation to communicate with each other. And you see this ample evidence of this on Snapchat and Instagram, where on a daily basis, over 1 billion users are communicating with each other, whether you like it or not. I'm sure many of you don't like this, but they are communicating through videos and photos, visual content. So that's just quite remarkable. And then on the other side, you of course have this explosion in AI. And a very big part of AI, as Julia mentioned, is computer vision, the enterprise of building machines that can see. So what's interesting to me is that both of these substantial, significant areas of research and that have permeated our society really depend on advances in a third area, which is imaging, right? The business of creating images, creating photos. And here again, I have to say it's been just remarkable to see what's happened just in the last 12 months. Just in the last 12 months, over 2 billion cameras of all kinds have been sold worldwide. That's on a planet with less than 7 billion people. That's just absolutely staggering. So I think it's safe to say that we're in the middle of an imaging revolution. And one of the factors that has precipitated this revolution, in my mind, is a paradigm shift from what we call traditional imaging to computational imaging. So let me explain to you what computational imaging is, and then I'll show you a few examples. So we all know traditional imaging. You have a detector of some sort, and you have a lens. This is what we call a perspective lens. It essentially adheres to the camera obscura model, the pinhole model, and it accepts those rays of light that pass through its center of projection to produce the familiar linear perspective projection. That is, all the rays of light must pass through this point, and that determines the geometry of the image, and this is what you and I refer to as a photograph today, right? So let's think about this for a second. If you look at this space right here, this beautiful space, you have an infinite number of light rays bouncing around in this space. This is a high-dimensional entity that we refer to as the light field associated with this space. In fact, all of you are optically communicating with each other, whether you like it or not, either directly or indirectly. So this is a very complex entity called the light field. And what the traditional camera does is that it performs a very restrictive, very simple sampling from a single point of this very complex light field. So the thought is, perhaps we could map seen rays to pixels here on the detector in some unconventional way. Maybe we can create new types of images, new forms of visual information. So that brings us to the computational camera. The computational camera uses some sort of new optics. In fact, it doesn't even have to be a lens. It could be a series of optical elements that somehow maps seen rays to pixels in an unconventional way. Unconventional in two respects. Geometrically, this ray, which should have gone all the way down here, has been somehow redirected to this pixel, right? And photometrically, which means in terms of brightness and color, it came in being a yellow ray, and somehow it's been turned into a red ray before it arrives at the pixel. So the point that I'm trying to make is that a computational camera captures an optically coded image, where the coding is being done in some meaningful fashion. It is rich in information, but not ready for human consumption. And that's where the computational module comes in. It knows everything it needs to about the optics, and therefore it's able to computationally decode the image to produce a new type of image. So a question to ask is, why do this? What's wrong with the traditional camera? So the claim is that by using this juxtaposition of optics and computations, you can make the image richer in information, and you can make it a more interactive, immersive experience. So let me show you a few examples. The first example I want to talk about is this very long-standing problem called high dynamic range imaging. Dynamic range is a problem in any measurement field. So here you have a sensor and you have a scene. The scene is very harshly lit. You have a bright sky and of course, a dark silhouette. And since all the pixels on your image sensor are equal in sensitivity, you could have a large part of the sky that's just washed out, or you could have the whole person too dark. And once this information is lost, you simply cannot recover it. You've all taken pictures, let's admit it. We've all taken pictures like this before. And that's because the dynamic range of your image sensor is limited. It simply cannot span what the real world, the visual world, has to offer. So here's the idea we came up with. This is with Tomo Mitsunaga back in 2000. The idea is to create an image sensor with unequal pixels. So imagine that you have random transmittances or shades that are placed in front of all the pixels. You see that? These are little sunshades or masks, but they're randomized. And so now something interesting happens. If you have a pixel that is saturated or washed out, you likely have a neighbor that's not. And if you have a pixel that's too dark, you likely have a neighbor that produces meaningful information. So you have the good stuff interspersed with the bad stuff. You don't have areas of missing information. So you take this optically coded image and you apply a reconstruction algorithm to it, and it turns out you can significantly enhance the dynamic range of the image, even though the underlying sensor has a very limited dynamic range. So that's the idea. So let me show you a couple of examples. Here are two images taken with what I would call a really good DSLR camera, nice camera from a couple of years back. And you can see that because the lighting is really harsh, you get loss of information here and here, here and here. And now I'm going to show you exactly the same scenes shot with an assorted pixel camera. We call this assorted pixels. And you see that significantly more information is revealed. So I must say to you that with every extra bit of information, be it a machine or be it human beings, you're going to significantly improve the performance of either the information that is perceived or in terms of the performance of the computer vision system itself. So this was 2000, and it took us 15 years to get this technology commercialized. When you're in the business, if you have anything to do with hardware, you're in trouble. It takes forever. And I look at my colleagues producing these apps and algorithms and so on. That's easy stuff. This stuff is hard. So it took us 15 years, and I'm happy to say that ultimately this technology is now out there. In fact, have you ever wondered what the camera in your phone looks like? That's what it looks like right there, right? In fact, this is what it looks like. Take a look at this. You can barely see it from where you are. That's an entire camera that includes the assorted pixel sensor that I just showed you, with a lens, with a voice coil that actually controls the lens, and enough processing power to not only enhance the image, but even compress it, right? All of that shrunk into this little thing. So now this technology is in the state-of-the-art image sensors, which are found in these camera modules. And how many of you have bought a phone in the last 3 years? Excellent. You may be using this technology without realizing it. Can you believe that? So it's actually reached over 1 billion users now worldwide, just in the last 12 months. So this is the idea of assorted pixels, but assorted pixels goes beyond dynamic range. So let me show you an example. So what we've created really is a platform on which I think we can develop other computational features. So here is an image that is taken with an assorted pixel camera where every pixel blinks at a different time and for a different duration. A random time for a random duration. Do you see what I'm saying? So pixels have control over their own integration or exposure. So obviously, if you look at this picture up close, you end up seeing something like this. It looks garbled. But you see, what you're doing is, even though the picture is shot in a short amount of time. Within this time, you have a sampling over space and time. And therefore, from this single picture, you can reconstruct a little video. Right? These are features that are going to be coming in the years to come, photo to video. All right, so that was dynamic range. Now let's talk about resolution. If you look at a really good camera in the market today, it's probably gives you 10, 20, or 30 megapixels in terms of resolution. So the question is, why haven't we yet seen a camera that produces 1 billion pixels? Now, don't ask the question why you need 1 billion pixels. We'll get to that in a second. But a 1 billion pixel camera, which would be a gigapixel camera, why haven't we seen this? Is there a fundamental limit? So let's take a look at the architecture of a really good camera, a DSLR camera. The first instinct may be to think that, well, maybe it's the sensor. You just simply can't pack in 2 billion pixels in the sensor. But it turns out that a pixel is now down to a micron, 1 micron, right? Anything below that, and then you've hit the limits of diffraction. So it's 1 micron. You can easily pack in 2 billion pixels in a sensor of that sort. Not a problem using today's technology. So then it must be the lens. And when I say that, the first instinct is to imagine that maybe the lens is imperfect. But let's say you even had a perfect lens, it turns out that you cannot take a point in a scene and map it to a perfect point in the image. You have something called geometric aberrations. By the mere fact that lenses occupy volume, you can't map a point to a point. There's always going to be a little bit of blurring in the image. That's loss of resolution. And mathematically, one can show that the only way to overcome geometric aberrations is to make the camera really big. Right? That's why you make these massive cameras that can produce stunning images. So my student Oliver Cosset and I started thinking about this. How do we break this limit? Because you're never going to be able to carry that in your pocket, right? Will we be able to develop a portable, small, compact camera that can capture 1 billion pixels, no less? Turns out to do that, you have to change the architecture of the camera. Instead of capturing an image on a plane, which actually is a very hard thing to do because you want the quality to be good everywhere, if you capture it on a curved surface, it turns out that these geometric aberrations I just talked about get simpler and reduced, and you can manage these computationally. So here's the idea. You have a lens that looks like this. It's a ball lens, and you cup this with not a planar, but a hemispherical sensor. Now, unfortunately for us, we don't have hemispherical solid-state silicon sensors. They're very difficult to make. So what you do is you create a tiling of these little cell phone camera types of sensors, like the ones that I showed you, all over there. Create a tiling, and then that covers the entire field of view. Now, when you look at this picture, you realize that there's going to be gaps between these sensors, naturally. You don't want to lose information there. And that's why you have these little bumps. These are called relay lenses that ensure that all the visual information is captured, a contiguous image is captured within the hemisphere, which still has these geometric aberrations, but they're reduced down to what are called spherical aberrations, and now you can apply an algorithm to remove those spherical aberrations. It's called deconvolution. So let me show you one example. This is an example. It is a 1.7 billion pixel image that we captured. PowerPoint is not the right way to do this. I can't show you high resolution there, so I'm going to go to this tool, which is not behaving well. So let me try this once more. Yes, okay. So I'm going to zoom back at this thing. This is the whole still life image. And then let's go in and choose something. Have you been curious to know what loofah looks like? Here's loofah. You see that?
I think it's not showing.
It's not showing up here? All right. So in that case, I'm going to get rid of this. I have to now I have to show you this, right? Because I've already drawn you into it. So let's see. You do see that, right? So that's loofah. Okay, so now let's go to this little dollar bill there. So you see the stippling on the dollar bill? And then much later, after we captured the scene, we realized there was something in there that we hadn't seen before. There's a remote controller, and when you look at the remote controller up close, you see a fingerprint. You see that? So, I'm going to get back here 1 second. So this idea of being able to see things that the photographer was not able to see when he or she captured the image is interesting. In fact, if you think about imaging in general, the idea is to walk into new visual worlds. If you think about MRI, CAT scans, microscopy, telescopes, all of this stuff is really about us trying to see things that we can't see with our naked eye. So we walk into these worlds that reveal things that we had not known before. So now let me show you a very simple example of what you can do with this, a very thin slice of an example. Imagine you had this kind of a gigapixel camera, and you take a picture of a person with it, right? Now what you can do after the fact is that you can zoom into one of the eyes of the person, and you would see that. I know this is sort of freaking all of you out, but we'll stick with the positive stuff. So here you see that you see the cornea of the eye, and the point that I'm trying to make is that the cornea of your eye has a thin film of tear on it that makes it behave like a reflective surface, right? And it turns out that the shape of this reflective surface, a normal adult cornea is very well known. It's ellipsoidal in shape with very strict parameters. And so all you need to do is to find the boundary between the cornea and the sclera, the white part, which is called the limbus. And once you've found this, you know where this ellipsoidal mirror is, how far it is, and how it's oriented with respect to the camera used to capture the image. In other words, your corneal imaging system has been calibrated now. What I'm trying to say to you is that I take a picture of you, you could be looking off in any direction, and I apply my little algorithm to find the limbus, and now I know where your ellipsoidal eye is facing with respect to the camera, and therefore I can come back and take the information inside the cornea, the reflection, and map it into a wide-angle image of the world around the person. Okay? So here are eyes looking off in different directions. In each case, I find the limbus, and then I map that into these wide-angle images. These wide-angle images have fields of view that are bigger than the field of view of the eye itself, because it's a reflection from the surface. It's not the light that's going into the eye. And in each case, the shape is different. And the reason is that the field of view of your corneal imaging system depends on the direction in which you're looking with respect to the camera. And that's different in each one of these cases. You see that? So that brings us to the interesting piece here. If you look at the limbus, it's in general an ellipse. When you're looking straight back at the camera, it's a circle, otherwise it's an ellipse. The parameters of this ellipse are telling you which direction the person's looking in with respect to the camera. That information can be used in conjunction with this environment map to obtain an estimate of the image that's falling on your fovea. In other words, without planting a chip inside your eye, I can, from a photograph of you, figure out, irrespective of where you're looking, I can figure out what you're looking at. You see that? These are what we call retinal images. So in this case, the person's looking at the CNN logo. We know this to be true because we asked her to look at the CNN logo. Right? In this case, the person's looking at the man on the right, and here the player is going for the yellow ball. Okay, now I want to show you the same thing in video. I'm going to show you a conversation between three people. We shoot the video of one of the eyes of one of the three people, and then on the right side, I'm going to show you what we compute as the retinal video, that is our estimate of what that person's looking at.
Do you want to come over for dinner tonight?
Sure. What time?
How about 7?
That's just a raw video.
Do you want to come over for dinner tonight?
Sure. What time?
How about 7?
See how the gaze changes?
Do you want to come over for dinner tonight?
Sure, what time?
How about 7?
There's something interesting about this video. If I keep showing this to you, I could hypnotize you. So this idea of being able to passively figure out what a person is looking at from a photograph or a video is really interesting. It gets you one step closer to perhaps understanding what their intent might be. So we are developing new computer interfaces, human-computer interfaces, that exploit this idea. But I want to show you an example that we didn't think about. There is a society called the Daguerrean Society, which has a large collection of the first photographs that were ever taken, daguerreotype camera, right? And what they've tried to do is to go into the pictures. Some of these pictures are really poor in quality, but they've tried to find the ones that have reasonably good eyes and try and figure out, for instance, in this case, what may have been around this grumpy man back in 1845. So we applied our algorithm to one of his eyes, and we got this. See, that's a retinal image. And here is an artist's sketch or rendering of what he or she believes may have been in the scene back in 1845. There's clearly no proof, but if you stare at this long enough, you'll believe it. That's the power of visual persuasion. Okay, so we have talked about dynamic range. We talked about resolution and field of view. Now I want to talk about a different dimension, a really important one, which is depth. We all believe that 3D is important. That's the way we experience the world. So here you have a camera, and sitting in front of it this time is a hollow cone, which is mirrored on the inside surface. Okay? It's a hollow cone. Now imagine you have one point in the scene. That point, of course, gets seen directly by the lens of the camera because it's a hollow cone. But it turns out that it gets seen exactly 2 more times via reflections by the hollow cone. So every point in the scene is going to be captured exactly 3 times, but in the same image from 3 different viewpoints. So it's an image that has multiple viewpoints inside of it. If I take this and point it at a person, I would get an image that looks like this. This is Anne Fleming, who works with me. So we have a normal view of Anne in the center, of course, because you're looking through the hollow cone. But in this distorted annulus, you have an embedding of 2 more views. And just to prove that to you, if you take the left eye of Anne, you see that it shows up again here and here. The same thing applies to every image. So now what you can do is you have a single picture, but you can peel off the 3 views from it computationally, and you can lift the 3-dimensional structure of Anne from it. Okay, so that brings me to the last research piece that I want to show you. If you really think about what's been happening in imaging, just like I showed you, the idea has been to shrink the camera down to essentially a point. I mean, this is really a point for you. So what's happening is that all of this optics, the innovations in optics, imaging, processing, computations, all of that stuff is being shrunk down to essentially a point. And so the goal has been to capture a fantastic image from a single point with very high resolution and very high fidelity in terms of dynamic range and so on, right? But let's think about imaging differently. What if we can take our pixels and instead of shrinking it down to a point, distribute our pixels perhaps on, let's say, a sheet that's something like this, okay? So that we can print them out like 3M perhaps could print it out like rolls of plastic. So if you place it down here, then the camera is sort of looking up. You can wrap various things around with it. If you're not happy with the field of view, you can flex it around, right? And the field of view adapts. This is the idea that we've been exploring of a flexible sheet camera. So flexible sheet camera, if you had it, you could wrap it around a pole and you would get 360-degree video. You could wrap it around a car and you would get complete situational awareness. Or you might create a credit card camera that you pull out of your wallet and you are not happy with the field of view, you just sort of flex it to adjust the field of view. That's the vision here. So how do we do this? Well, it's actually very easy to create a sheet camera. Imagine that you have a sheet on which you have an array of pixels. You can print these out using organic materials, actually, these days, just like transparencies. You can print them out. And then you would place on top of this a lens array, such as this, so that for every pixel on the sheet, you have an accompanying lens and you have a field of view that's created by it. That's straightforward enough. We know how to do this. If you took this roll and just pasted it on the screen, it would be looking at you straight ahead, right? But the question is, what's going to happen if you flex it? It's the flexing part that's interesting to us. Well, if you flex this, you're going to have gaps between the fields of view. And so the key idea here, key innovation, was to design a lens array made of elastic material, polymers. So this is an elastic lens array. And if you choose the right material properties, and if you choose the right geometry for the lens, it turns out that when you flex it, of course, there's going to be curvature here, and the lens is going to deform on top as such, right? But you can make it deform in such a way that the field of view changes exactly the way you would like without creating any overlap with adjacent fields of view or any dead space in between them. That's the key idea. It's a passive system that adapts optically to the field of view that you're trying to get. So where we're going with this is this idea that I mentioned of a credit card type of camera. You pull it out, you're looking at the image, you don't like the field of view, you flex it around, and you can then put it back in your camera. So that brings me to the last piece. Do I have a few minutes, Julia? Okay. And the last piece has nothing to do with research. This is a sort of a social project that I've been doing on the side with a couple of my students for many years, for about 5 years. And the question that I was asking was, doing what we do here, imaging and cameras, we are acutely aware of the power of the camera. There's no other piece of technology like it in its ability to inspire us, allow us to express ourselves. So can we somehow leverage this unique piece of technology, redesign it, and then turn it into a platform for education? So here's what we came up with. It's this idea, this a kit called Big Shot. Big Shot is a play on words. It's the idea of exposing young kids, particularly underprivileged young kids, to science and engineering concepts and then turning them into big shots. So there's about 25 different pieces here. And what the student does is put these pieces together to create a digital camera. So that's the science and engineering part. There is an accompanying website that has 10 chapters or so where all the concepts, related concepts, are described in detail with visualizations and so on. And then once they're done, they walk into the world of photography and storytelling. So it's one of those unique places where the arts and the sciences meet, and therefore it's been able to draw a lot of kids. I mean, obviously boys and girls, but also in particular underprivileged kids in very remote areas of the world. So let me first show you how Big Shot comes together. Let me just lower the volume just a bit. So once you have put it together, you get something like this. So here's Big Shot right here. It has a couple of interesting features. It has a normal field of view right there, a panoramic field of view, and a stereo field of view. That is, it creates an anaglyph, so you can wear red-green glasses and see what you've shot in 3D. Now imagine you're out on a shoot, and you have no power. Well, then you crank it up. Right? And so you may be thinking, would you really need a power generator in a camera? That's kind of silly. Yes, you do. The reason is you can use this as an excuse to describe to kids how gears work, and motors, dynamos, electromagnetism, and all that good stuff. And then you also have an LED that's allowed to that takes pictures, so you can describe semiconductors and all of that stuff. There's a little display in the back. You get the idea. So that's Big Shot, and I'm happy to say that over 100,000 kids, worldwide have built Big Shot and learned from Big Shot. Am I done here? I have to hurry up. Do I have two minutes? Okay, 2 minutes. So if it's 2 minutes, let me just show you some of the pictures that the kids have taken. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I'll do so with a very simple observation. For the longest time, we've said to ourselves, a picture is worth 1,000 words. We say this all the time. And when we think about where computational imaging is going and what we're trying to do here, we're trying to make the image richer in information, an experience that is more interactive, more immersive. So perhaps what we're trying to do is to make a picture worth 1,000,000 words. Thank you.
Okay. Jerry Oestreicher, Columbia and Princeton. What you described is incredibly impressive. I say this as a photographer and an astronomer. And I hope the other astronomers here are listening, because you've beat the diffraction limit, it seems. And now they don't have to build 30-meter telescopes. They can build 3-meter telescopes and save many billions of dollars. Is that right?
That's not, I wish I could claim that. But that's not an,
I make a little joke.
It turns out that we're not even close to the diffraction limit. What we are trying to solve, what we've tried to address here is geometric aberrations which come before the diffraction limit. We're far from even getting close to the diffraction limit. So one day. There's one back there.
Hello, I'm Emily Thompson, New York. I think I speak for a lot of people here when I ask, how do you get a big shot? Where can I go to get one?
Let's talk after, during lunch.
George Whitesides, Harvard. When you go to imaging techniques like MRI that rely on fundamentally different properties, are there equivalent methodologies that you can use to suit some of the kinds of things that you're doing?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about tomography, and you think about tomography and X-rays, you're projecting X-rays through things and getting projections, which are these line integrals. And then you use mathematics to take those measurements that don't really look like images to then reconstruct a three-dimensional volume or a two-dimensional image. A lot of those techniques we could use here, and some of the techniques that we are developing could be used in medical imaging as well.
And is there evidence that insects with ball eyes use some of these same techniques?
Please repeat that.
Insects with ball eyes.
You're talking about Ommatidia?
Yeah.
Well, that lens that I showed you does look that way, but it's very different because each little lenslet that I was showing you there is actually mapping onto a fairly substantial image, whereas in the case of insects, you're looking at a very small number of pixels and often one.
Friends, we have just a couple of minutes before lunch. How about if we invite the 4 presenters up on the stage and see what they might tell us about what are the next steps for AI and what we